You're tuned in to Women in America, the podcast that dives deep into the issues shaping gender equality in the US and beyond. Hosted by Pari and Eve, public health professionals by day and content creators by passion, we bring you expert insights and actionable strategies to push the fight for equality forward in today's America. On this episode of Women in America, I speak with Texas organizer and activist Olivia Juliana about how Republicans' redistricting in Texas will affect women across the state. Let's dive in. Olivia, thanks for being here. I feel like you are not just the expert on what we're about to talk about today, but like the expert on activism and organizing and just like capitalizing on the life of being a woman in America. So I'm like super pumped to chat with you. The first time you came across my radar was actually when you beat Matt Gaetz's ass in a way that like nobody has ever beat down a man before. Like talk about a clapback of clapbacks, right? Like social media loves people who clap back, but like you were like, I'm gonna take this moment and turn it into organizing, fundraising, activation, all of the good stuff. And I was like, oh my God, who is this woman? Because she's hella cool. So I would love for you to just tell us how you came up with that idea. And in fact, just like tell us what happened, because in case other people aren't familiar with that story.
Yeah, well, at the time I was 19. This was in 2022, and it was July 2022, so it was about a month after the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade.
Mhm.
And so the organization I was working at the time, Gen Z for Change, in response to Roe being overturned, we had an initiative that we had started and built up called the Safer Initiative, which was basically to give people different resources on how to mitigate, the Dobbs decision. So if you wanted to educate yourself, if you wanted to get registered to vote, if you wanted to learn about the laws in your area, like we had areas there that you could go to on the website to figure out. And one of them that we had was fundraising, which was fundraising for abortion funds, because we understood, me living in Texas and having done some repro work at the time, I understood a lot of the very heavy lifting around abortion access was going to be done by abortion funds. And so we made the decision to start fundraising for them. And we had raised some money up until that point. And so one day I got a text message from my friend, and he was like, did you know that Matt Gaetz is talking about you on Twitter right now? And I had no idea. I had tweeted at him the week before because he had made some gross comments about, abortion rights activists. And I tweeted at him a week before or so and said something along the lines of like, he said that all abortion activists are like 5'6", like 350 pounds, just like trying to denigrate, women and abortion. And so I was just like, I'm not 5'6", I'm 5'11", I'm 6'4" in heels. So I wear them to remind small men like you of your place. And his response was, he went to this conference at Turning Point USA, and he went
As the conservatives do.
Of course. And he just went on a rant about, abortion rights activists and all this stuff. And so then when all this happened, he tweeted out a picture of my photo, and it was an attempt to body shame me, to make me feel bad. And mind you, at the time, I was 19 years old. So I was 19 years old, and I had now a member of Congress on his social media profile with 1 million followers coming after me in this like very obvious way. And so I was like, you know what? I have two options here. I could sit here and feel sorry for myself, or I could use the hatred that I knew people had for Matt Gaetz to do something good. So I responded with how I really felt, which was something along the lines of like, I might let people make me feel bad about myself, maybe, but I'm not going to let an alleged child sex trafficker make me feel bad about myself. And I posted that. I know that you seemingly have a thing for teenagers, Matt, but like 19 seems to be pushing it, right? Which people responded to en masse and started sharing. But once I realized I had people's attention, I was like, this is a good place for me to start. So I, in his name, started fundraising for abortion funds, and it just took off from there. And, I was posting memes and jokes about like me as a WWE wrestler, like with him in a chokehold. And it ended up in about 5 days raising $2.3 million for 50 abortion funds across the country the month after Roe v. Wade was overturned. I think people like to kind of watch the story of that a little bit. I was very nasty and mean to him. I was very I was posting memes. Though. And I'll say this, it was very Trumpian. How I was behaving. I was like, you are a wimp and you are weak and nobody likes you. And but I was just going on. Fact? It was the truth. And, I had all that attention on me. We raised all that money. I think at the end of the day, each abortion fund got about $50,000.
That's freaking amazing. Like,
It was just amazing.
I didn't know you at the time, and I was just like, I'm so proud of this girl, like woman, like whoever she is. I was like, I want to know her, you know? And like, yeah, let's be real, like Matt Gaetz constantly comments on the bodies of teenagers, right? And like, I just feel like the way that you humbled him, like I almost feel like you're being harsh to yourself, where you're like, it was mean. Like, I actually think it wasn't mean enough. Like,
well,
he continued to serve on Congress after that. I was like, what? Like,
well, you know, I get the last laugh in the story for a couple of reasons. The year following, I actually met him. I was at the State of, and this is the part of the story a lot of people don't actually know. I met him at the State of the Union, and he came up to me, and I put my hand down. He shook my hand before he could register who I was. And so I'm shaking his hand, and I kind of lean in, and I was like, I just wanted to tell you thank you for helping me raise all that money for abortion funds. And he was furious. He was furious. He like dropped my hand and started muttering something to himself, and he kind of turned and walked away, and I kind of hollered at him, and I was like, you're a coward. And it was so surreal because this was also the House floor after the State of the Union had been over. And so like there are like diplomat and elected officials walking by as this is happening. And I remember because when I yelled at him and I was like, you're a coward, I turned and looked, and Senator Raphael Warnock was standing right there and like saw me yell this at him. It was kind of like, and it is surreal. And then, you know, now of course we know like he's not in Congress anymore, and he's like grifting and doing Cameo, and nobody really cares about him. So I think I kind of get the last laugh in all of this.
I think you got the laugh in every step of the way. Let's be clear. Like, you raised more than $2 million for abortion funds at a time when the need was exceptionally high. You took something that would have honestly crippled a lot of people's self-esteem, and instead just like roared back in a way that I think is so inspiring. Like, I actually think now that you're telling me the story in person, I'm like, oh, this is like Crash Out or Clap Back, like Olivia Juliana edition, you know? It's just like, you really just like nailed it. And yeah, is he actually on Cameo now?
I think so, yeah. And I only know that because for my birthday last year, a couple of my friends were going to pitch in and try to get him to make a cameo for me. That I was kind of like, happy birthday, Olivia. When they kind of floated this idea to me, I was like, don't do it. Like, don't give him any money.
Yeah.
Like, let him go be a Nepo baby down in Florida. But last I heard, like, he's not doing much. I think he just had a baby. Congratulations, I guess. God bless that child. I wish it peace and security.
I mean, yes, that poor kid. I can imagine growing up with a parent like that. But that was just like activism 101 for you, because you kind of just like carried on this like organization and activism train in Texas, which is that your home state?
But yes, behind me, if you can see, I have an Ann Richards portrait right here. She's the last Democratic governor of Texas. And I have a framed portrait here of Barbara Jordan. She was the first Black woman from the South elected to Congress. And she also was on the committee that impeached Richard Nixon. She's the congresswoman from Houston. I was born and raised here. I'm a fourth generation Texan. My children will probably be fifth generation Texans. This is my home. I love it here. I have no intention of leaving anytime soon.
That's amazing. And I think that not just like the connection to the place, but like also the intent of being like, I'm in it for the long haul, and I'm going to do what I can to make this place reflect more of like who I am, as opposed to the other way around, which is actually great, because today what I was hoping to chat with you about is all of the things that have gone down in Texas over the last like 3 weeks, 4 weeks. I mean, I like when we were in the thick of it, even 24 hours felt like a week, because there had been like so many updates. And I think that, you know, you especially, but you and I both being in the creator circles and being able to access lawmakers and information, I think we might have a more like comprehensive understanding of what went down than like, let's say, the lay average American. And so I was wondering if we could sort of just get your like insight on what happened and sort of like explain to folks, this is kind of what went down and why it happened this way and that sort of thing. So for people listening, as we all know, the Trump administration has been trying to do whatever they can to not release the Epstein files, because that is like blowing up even with their own base. And one of the things that they decided to take on as a way of initially being a distraction, but then turned into like, frankly, a like giant attack on democracy, was that Texas decided to gerrymander the entire state 5 years earlier than they normally would, right? And Olivia, you have a lot of experience dealing with Greg Abbott and dealing with the clowns in the Texas House State Legislature. So tell us a little bit about what that process looked like and sort of just what happened along the way.
So I think the best way to understand what's going on is to actually go back in time a little bit. In 2003, George W. Bush was president of the United States, and he had formerly been the governor of Texas. Famously beat, I think it was Ann Richards, to become governor of Texas. And in
Sorry, just side
2003,
note. Do you remember when all of us thought that George W. Bush was the worst that could have happened to us in the
yes,
moment?
yes.
And how wrong we were.
Well, and this is an example of remembering who George W. Bush was. So 2003, George W. Bush's approval rating was going down. So he was going into 2004. Midterms were happening. I think it was, no, hold on. Okay, I know where I'm going with this up. 2003. So we just had the 2002 elections. George W. Bush was not particularly popular because of the war on terror. He was an incumbent. They just were not happy with the Republican Party because they felt like they were focusing on the wrong things. The economy wasn't doing great, and there was a lot of unpopular foreign policy going on. Sound familiar? Yeah. So Republicans in Texas at the time, one of the Republican leaders in Congress, his name was Tom DeLay. He was a congressman here in actually the area I grew up in, Fort Bend County. They decided that they were going to go through with mid-decade redistricting to give themselves an advantage in the 2004 election. So what they did was they went through this process saying we're going to redistrict just like they similarly did here in Texas, with the goal in mind of picking up 5 congressional seats for Republicans.
Weird.
And yeah, it's so weird. And so what ended up happening is you had some Texas Democrats broke quorum and they ended up coming back and the maps passed. And so we saw in the following election, Republicans pick up 5 congressional seats in the state of Texas. And Texas Democrats have not been able to recover from that loss since. So all the way back in 2003, they set the foundation for what they are doing in Texas now, which is mid-decade redistricting, which is redistricting your congressional maps early, specifically to give yourselves a partisan political advantage. And so they did it all the way back then, and that's what they just did now. So murmurs of this started happening all the way back in March, which is when I started tracking it. There were reports coming out that the Trump administration and Trump's team had been pressuring the Texas legislature to take up this mid-decade redistricting in the legislative session. And it was very much not embraced at first. So as time went on, we had our own back and forth battles here in Texas in our session. And from that, it became very clear that they were going to do whatever Trump wanted them to do. Then we find out Trump has now directed Governor Abbott to go through with this mid-decade redistricting. And so he calls a special session, he puts it on the agenda, and the goal is the same thing it was in 2003, bring me 5 brand new congressional seats. Well, and I know I'm going on such a long tangent here, but I feel like it's important for people to understand the context of this. The redistricting committee that was in charge of this, in charge of putting up the bill, because the bill's got to go through the committee before it gets to the state house, they held public hearings about redistricting before we even had a proposed map to redistrict these congressional districts. They held these hearings. They said, we don't have any maps. We're just talking about the topic. Hearings wrapped up Saturday. Tuesday, we had proposed maps. Coincidentally, right after the public hearings had ended, we had proposed maps. And so now it has passed the Texas House and it passed the Texas Senate. They purposefully cut debate off to stop a state senator who had been planning to filibuster the bill. They cut it off so she could not do that. And that bill is going to be signed into law by Governor Abbott. And it is going to likely produce 5 more Republican congressional districts in the state of Texas going into the 2026 midterm elections.
Yeah. So I am often talking about reproductive health, right? And how like all of the different policies in the US tie into the lives of women, regardless of whether people understand that or not. And one of the things I often say is that like when Trump became president this time, I was like, okay, they're going to pass a national ban without passing a national ban, right? On abortion. It's like a ban by another name. And that's kind of, I think, how I've been looking at what they're doing in Texas too, is like they are still going to have elections. People are still going to have the right to vote, but are those elections going to be sound? Are those votes going to actually reflect what people are thinking? And the answer is no, right? Because they are, I know you apologize for providing the context, but I think the context is actually critical because it's like what they're doing is they're making it look like everything is still kosher. Like, yeah, okay, we're still having midterm elections. Yeah, everyone can vote. Yeah, we're not like restricting people or whatever, but they're fundamentally changing what those results can ever be. Like regardless looks like, right? And I think that that is what is critically important because as you know, as I know, as everyone listening knows, Republicans love to be able to speak their narrative, right? And what their narrative will be in 2026 is like, well, Texas voted and Texas wants Republicans. And in fact, the truth is that Texas is not necessarily a red state. It's just a rigged state. Like, it's gerrymandered so intensely that the true blue, or that's just an expression, but like the true blue needs and wants and vision of people who live there might not actually ever be actualized if this is how we continue to go on.
Yeah. Well, it's 100% voter suppression because, Texas is 27 million people that live here. It's a ginormous state. And the way that they drew these congressional maps, if you ever have a conversation with someone who decides that they're going to run for Congress, I have a friend who went through this process a few months ago when he was thinking about running for state house. And he told me he was running for this district. And I said, okay, well, what's the population of the district? And he said, well, it's a majority white district. And I said, okay, well, are you looking at the population of the district's people or the population of the district's voters?
Voters.
Because that's the distinct difference that a lot of people aren't talking about when it comes to these congressional maps. Is it true that the way they drew these maps is they're now majority Hispanic districts? Yes, that's true. A lot of these are majority Hispanic congressional districts, but they're majority white voting congressional districts. So even though these districts are drawn to represent minority voters, they're not. They're actually drawn so that the people who are casting the votes are predominantly white. And it's because gerrymandering here is so severe. What ends up happening is we have this system here in Texas where you draw these congressional districts, but none of them are really seriously competitive. So what ends up happening is you have Republicans and Democrats alike, likely, who their only concern is to get through their primary election. So once they get through their primary election, which is a much smaller voting base, which are much more highly tuned in voters, they don't necessarily have to be worried about getting through their general election. So what ends up happening is we see a dip and a fall off in the campaign. And that's where we end up with something like Harris County. I live in Harris County. It's the largest, bluest county in the state. In 2020, Joe Biden won Harris County by 13.5 points. In 2024, Kamala Harris won Harris County by 5.5 points. And a big part of this drop off is we had over 1 million eligible voters in Harris County alone who did not vote. A majority of them lived in our Democratic congressional districts. And the reason why this happens is because people here are so accustomed to understanding like this isn't going to change because it's drawn to not change. And so when you'll hear people say something like, well, you can't gerrymander a statewide race. You absolutely can. Because if you condition people to believe that their vote does not matter, if you condition them to understand that their elections are already predetermined in a certain way, it is not going to incentivize them to come out to vote. So when I hear people say things like, we're not going to have elections, we're going to have elections to your point. They're not going to stop us from having elections. They're just going to convince us that our elections don't matter. It costs them less money. It's less headache for them. All they have to do is convince us that nothing's going to change, and people are going to be convinced that that's true. So that's what's happened in Texas, and that's why we've had 30 years of Republican control of the state.
Yeah, it's voter suppression by another name. We've established that. But I think the harsh part about it too is that it makes, when we experience, like you and I, for example, have experienced this now twice within our own activism lifetimes, right? And I think it makes the average person feel like, what's the point? Like, I already think my vote is not going to count. Or I think that even if it does count, it's like they're going to change it so that it doesn't count in the future, right? Yeah. So you and I have previously rallied for Kamala Harris and other Democrats, but I think it's also worth us asking, like, the Democrats tried to fight back against this process. They left so that there wasn't quorum, and then they came back. Are you able to sort of provide a brief synopsis on like what that process was, just so people know like how there were attempts to fight back, and then the goal of them leaving might have actually been different than what mainstream media was talking about, and I think we'll understand that. So would love to hear from you on that.
Yeah. So quorum is the number of members of a political body you have to have present in order to do any business. So in the Texas House, I believe it is a 2/3 majority. So you have to have 2/3 of the 150 member legislative body to conduct any official House business. So So we had the topic of redistricting proposed. There were public hearings about it. Once it became extremely clear the Republicans were not going to budge on this at all, the Democratic caucus made the conscious decision to break quorum, which means to deny the Republicans the ability to do business in the State House. Now, Democrats have done this before a couple of times in history, and the most recent time, which is actually very important to this conversation, was in 2021. In 2021, this was into Joe Biden's first year of his presidential term. Democrats had a majority in the U.S. House and in the U.S. Senate. In the state of Texas, the Texas Republicans proposed a voter suppression bill that would have made it more difficult for people to vote. And so because of this, the Texas Democrats at the time, which included our, now beloved Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who at the time was in the state house, they left the state, denied Republicans a quorum, and they went to Washington, D.C. And they went there to lobby and beg for for legislators in Congress to pass H.R. 1, which was the John Lewis for the People Voting Rights Act, which included a ban to partisan gerrymandering. Well, Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin were in the Senate at the time, and they refused any kind of filibuster carve-out to pass this legislation. So the Texas Democrats had no choice but to go home, and the bill ended up passing. So now we fast forward to where we're at today in 2025, and it's a similar story. They put up redistricting, and the Texas Democrats have no choice. They're like, we don't have any other choice but to deny quorum. But this is the important distinction people need to understand here. Because of what happened in 2021, state Republicans wanted to make it more difficult for Democrats to be able to use this tool of breaking quorum, because it's one of the few tools they have in such a minority.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They imposed rules in the state house that if you were breaking quorum, then you would be fined up to $500 a day for every day that you're breaking quorum. So if I am a Texas Democrat and I break quorum, I can't pay for that with my own campaign funds. And in the Texas legislature, these are regular working people. It is not a full-time position. They make $600 a month to be a state legislator. A lot of them are lawyers or real estate agents or, teachers, whatever it may be. So we can't ask these normal working people to personally pay $500 a day. So what ended up happening is they felt there was no other choice. They broke quorum and they went to these other states. And this brought so much national attention to the issue because, who are these, renegade lawmakers from Texas? And it brought so much national attention to the issue that now a lot of these governors who may have been slow to act kind of have the political capital and the trust from voters to potentially redistrict if they need to. And that's what Gavin Newsom is doing now in California. The Texas Democrats went back. Personally speaking, I wish that they could have stayed away longer, but I also understand why they came back, because just 2 days ago, we saw when they came back to the state capitol, despite, mind you, they had DPS, which is Department of Public Safety officers, parked outside of their homes, doing
The
surveillance
FBI
on
was
their
tracking
families. The
Yeah.
FBI was tracking them. Like, if they were seen, they were to be arrested and brought back to the cap. Like, that's how severe this is.
Yeah.
And so they came back and they were given bills of their fines. Every Texas state legislator who broke quorum received a bill of about $10,000 for denying them quorum for about 2 weeks. $10,000. And so, but people say, why did they come back? I challenge you to think of, well, do you have $10,000 to spend to go do this? The only way that this would have not gone through is if they just stayed away until after the midterm elections. Like in Texas, they can change the rules whenever they want to. And so that's why they came back. And it's unfortunate. And now, Republicans are going to make it even harder to use breaking quorum as a tool for Democrats. And so, but we accomplished what we needed to. California is redistricting now, and other states know, people are going to have their backs if they do this. And I think that's what really matters here.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point I was making when I asked you the question is I think the intention over the course of them being away changed, right? Because they were like, if we have to kind of immediately just do what we can to stop these gerrymandered maps from passing, even if it's giving ourselves a little more time to come up with a plan. And then because of the attention it started to get, it was like, okay, now the goal is going to become getting other Democratic governors from other states to come on board and understand that we need to fight fire with fire, right? And you and I understand that even if Gavin Newsom does redistrict California, which I'm glad he is doing, to accommodate for 5 additional Democratic seats to negate, in quotation marks, the loss of 5 get seats in Texas, there is still such impact on Texans, right? Like of all of these laws that they're doing, like we need to not let that go. Like the fact of the matter is that Greg Abbott and his GOP cronies will literally do anything that Trump directs them to because they don't give a fuck about the people that they actually represent.
Yeah.
And I think that that is something that kind of gets lost in this whole conversation because we have like Fox News and other forms of entertainment, because I refuse to call them news, blaming Democrats for doing what is actually a very legal democratic process. And at the same time, Republicans are employing illegal methods like using the FBI to track reps when there's no justification for that, to essentially undermine the voting rights, the voting capacity, the voting impact of everyday Texans, right? And I think that that is a hard thing for people to grapple with because even more so, it makes them less likely to show up to the polls. And then we have to be able to like actively combat this like idea is like, okay, we're telling people to go out to vote, but it's like they already think that things aren't going to matter. And now they are seeing their own leaders, their elected leaders do things to make it even less so. So I wanted to ask, like, you started this conversation with me telling me that you're feeling good. You're like energized. I guess what's the like next? What comes from this action? What can like the average person both in and outside Texas do to kind of like, you know, stop the perpetuation of this harmful like redistricting in other places, or just even just stop the perpetuation of the GOP's practices in general?
Well, the number one thing we can do right now is we can halt this ballot proposition in California pass. It's going to be on the ballot November 4th of this year. And that is, I think, going to be the single most important organizing tactic that we have across the country. Because, yeah, it is true that, you know, these maps are drawn to give Democrats 5 more seats, but it's drawn to give Democrats 5 more seats and have 4 competitive House seats. So we have a potential possibility here where not only do we negate the 5 seats they're picking up in Texas, also we gain 4 additional congressional seats. So we could potentially pick up 9 Democratic congressional seats from the state of California, which could greatly offset any kind of engineered Republican House majority that Republicans are trying to come up with. So the first thing you can do is, if you have the means to, is to donate to Gavin Newsom. The campaign is being run through Governor Newsom, and you can sign up once things are starting to get organized to vote bank, so text bank, phone bank. If you live in California, knock doors. It is going to be, I think, one of the most consequential elections that we've seen in the last 10 years outside of presidential elections, because it is going to affect not just California, but the entire country. Texas, you know, we've got lots of elections next year, but outside of getting involved in California, truly, it is getting involved on a local level makes such a difference, because Trump can give the orders, Abbott can give the orders, but ultimately they are not the ones enforcing them. It is your county commissioners, it is your sheriffs, it is your city council members, it is these people who you know, who are tangible, who are in your community, who are going to be the ones enforcing these practices and enforcing these orders. So you have to know who they are and get involved in those elections. You know, Houston, we had a mayoral election in 2023, and only 17% of eligible voters turned out in that election, and we ended up with, you know who's our mayor? There's a fun fact for you. The mayor of the city of Houston right now from that election in 2023 is the Democratic senator that came back to Texas in 2003 and allowed Republicans the quorum to pass the redistricting maps.
That's such a weird full circle moment.
It's a full circle moment. And that is why your local elections matter, because now that man is the person who has to make the decision on whether or not the city of Houston is going to cooperate with the Trump administration, which to this point they have. And that's why local elections matter. So those two things are the most important things you can do to fight back and beat back against what's going on. And also remember, there are more of us than there are of them. That period. There are more of us. There are more good people with good consciences who care about freedom, who care about the Constitution than them. They are just very good at being loud. So don't feel discouraged. Don't feel alone. You're not alone. You should have righteous encouragement right now, because people in American history have done a lot more more with a lot less than what we have been given right now for this fight.
That's so true. Righteous encouragement, especially because, let's flag the fact that like California is doing this with a democratic process. Like they're not just, Gavin Newsom didn't just come out and be like, yeah, fuck everybody, I'm gonna go do this, right? He's actually hosting an election to decide whether the people are okay with that, which is like the exact opposite of what Texas did. So, I will happily criticize the Democrats when they are deserving of that, but you gotta give them credit in this instance. It's like they are fighting fire with fire and still managing to go high while they do that. Like it's actually kind of incredible. And so I think that you're absolutely right. And to really hammer in this, the suggestion of what you were saying about local elections, I have to bring in reproductive health because that's kind of yours and my jam before we got into talking about elections. But I don't think people remember this, but last year, the Alabama state Supreme Court decision to get rid of IVF came at a time where all of these states were kind of floundering about how do we deal with what has happened in terms of the abortion restrictions and things like that, right? And at that point, Alabama and Arkansas were kind of considering bringing in Comstock laws from the 1800s to basically ban a whole bunch of things. I'm not going to explain it in detail because it's a long explanation, but simply to say that at the time, both states were considering bringing in laws that were from before those two states were even states at all, right? And at one point, Arkansas Republicans proposed banning contraception across the state because it was in violation of what they believed to be an interpretation of this 1800 law. And it was about to pass, on the verge of passing. It would have made contraception illegal across the state of Arkansas, which is just mind-blowing to think about. And it was stopped by one single woman, the state attorney general, who was not voted for in a local election and was actually up for re-election. So she put her seat on the line and she completely stopped it. And the story actually got buried because of the thousands of other headlines, unfortunately, that were coming up around abortion. But it was truly this singular election in which less than 10% of the state even decided to cast votes. This was the person who influenced whether women across the entire state would have access to birth control from that moment onwards, which is just so crazy to think about. But simply to say, you are so right. And people get tired of hearing this oh, go vote, go vote. But it is so true. Local elections exist for a reason. These electoral processes exist for a reason. And while it is unfortunate that on the federal scale, there's all of this work happening to undermine our voting, there's still so much opportunity to organize and get your voice heard at the local level, right? So I genuinely appreciate that. And I have also learned a lot during this conversation. Even though I've been reading about Texas for weeks, I didn't know about the context from 2003. And I feel that is pretty critical. I didn't know about the 2021 situation. So I actually just kind of assumed that the fee for staying away each day was kind of just built in already. And they knew that. So always appreciate you and your energy and your activism and all of the information that you're bringing to the table. What are the things that you are excited about right now in your own community and your own just organizing?
Oh, wow. I have so much on my plate nationally that when it's local, it's oh God, yeah, that is happening. We got a special election happening here in Houston for Texas. Oh, hello, my cat's over here. Texas's 18th congressional district. My friend Isaiah Martin is running for this seat. Mind you, a purposefully delayed election because Governor Abbott wanted to pad the House majority. So this congressional district has been without representation since March of this year, and they will go without representation until December of this year, likely. So that's pretty exciting. I'm looking at all these people who are ready and gearing up for elections we have in Texas next year. We have our governor election, our statewide candidate, and we have a Senate race here in Texas next year. And so, we got a lot of great candidates who have thrown their hat in the ring, who are thinking about it. And so there's nothing I love more than competitive primaries and watching competitive primaries now. And so that's what I'm excited about. Is I'm excited to see the candidates that are putting forward a new vision for the Democratic Party and what it is they're going to do with it. And so that's what I'm looking forward to here in Texas. And, come 2027, we'll see where we're at. We'll see what happens.
Well, thanks, Olivia, not just for your insight, but your positivity, because I'll be honest, yesterday I was having an anxious day, and I'm not even an anxious person, but I was looking at all of these headlines and I'm oh my God, where is the light? And then Olivia brought me the light today.
So well, thank you.
I'm great for that.
Well, I'm happy to talk anytime. I'm back.
Where do folks find you?
At Olivia Juliana everywhere. I'm there.
Excellent. Everywhere you're there.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Women in America. If you enjoyed it, share with your network and follow us on social media at women_in America. See you next week.